Right, good to go.
Eventually, the siege of the castle comes to an end, not because England intervenes, but because France intervenes. And Knox is actually taken captive and has to serve as a galley slave, tied to an oar on a French galley. And he suffers this really multiple deprivation. It's a very unpleasant experience for him. For something like a year or 18 months before he's finally released. But rather than coming back to Scotland, which is still in Catholic hands, he decides to go to England. And England is now under the rule of Edward VI, or Edward VI's Regency governments, Somerset and Northumberland. And it is much, much more overtly Protestant than the England of Henry VIII had been. And it's there that Knox really begins to make his name. He is sent and licensed to preach in the north of England, in Newcastle and Berwick, where there are substantial Scottish communities. And he rapidly establishes a reputation as a formidably good preacher, a pulpit orator, charismatic and highly effective in the pulpit. But he also establishes a reputation as being fundamentalist, of not accepting the prayer books that were continuously revised in Henry VIII's and Edward's reign. These were not, in Knox's view, radical enough. And he's particularly concerned about communion and kneeling at communion, and the idea that this retained too many vestiges of the Catholic Mass, and that there must be a much cleaner break from the Catholic Mass to something that's much more commemorative of the Lord's Supper and the Last Supper. That's the kind of position that he wishes to adopt. So you take communion not kneeling, but sitting round a table, and the bread and the wine are passed from hand to hand, rather than kneeling in front of the elevated host and a priest. So Knox becomes very much associated with what you might call the radical or fundamentalist wing of the English Church. And there are attempts, perhaps one way of looking at it is there are attempts to tame him, to sort of buy his loyalty to the establishment by making him a royal chaplain, by offering him a bishopric as a means of bringing him into the establishment and taming his radicalism. But these efforts don't really prove very successful. And in any event, in 1553, the whole political scenario and religious scene changes dramatically when Edward VI dies, and Mary Tudor comes to the English throne as a Catholic and sets about reversing the Protestant settlement and re-establishing Catholicism. And as a result of that, Knox, like many English Protestantism, takes refuge on the continent. And he initially ends up in Frankfurt, where there very rapidly develops an English congregation of several hundred people. And at Frankfurt, over the next year or so, in 1554, there's a struggle for control, if you like, between moderate Protestants and much more radical Protestants. And Knox is very much on the radical wing. He becomes identified as the leading light of the radicals. Ultimately, Knox loses that struggle and is forced out of Frankfurt, which decides to retain the Edwardian prayer book that Knox and others objected to. But I suppose one very interesting way of looking at this is that Knox, the Scotsman, through his actions at Frankfurt and in Edwardian England, really lays the basis of English Puritanism. He is the person who becomes identified with what would later become the Puritan wing of the English Church. What's also interesting is that he is totally outmaneuvered at Frankfurt He's still quite naive in many ways, in the way that he conducts his political and ecclesiological debates. He's not very good at the politics. He thinks people should just do as he says because he has said it and it is the word of God. And that's quite revealing of one key aspect of his personality and his persona, and that is that he really did see himself as God's prophet, God's messenger, God's trumpet. He had been called by God to utter God's will. And what he said in the pulpit, he took to be the word of God, almost unmediated. He also, as did many of the more radical Protestants in Frankfurt, look back on what had happened in England and say, well, what's happening with the